Hello YouTube! This will be the last video in the Art and Ethics series. Today we're looking at variabilism. Variabilism, you might remember, conjoins moderate moralism and moderate immoralism. Moderate moralism says that moral defects are sometimes aesthetic defects. Moderate immoralism says that moral defects are sometimes aesthetic virtues. I'll focus on the immoralist side in this video since that's the more controversial part, and we looked at moralism last time anyway. Variabilism has always struck me as the most plausible account. I think variabilism has the most prima facie plausibility. It's the default position, if you will. And there are really sort of two reasons for this. First of all, moral responses are just one kind of response among many. Think of all the other responses that we have to artworks. Artworks elicit sadness, anger, joy, melancholy, confusion, fear. These responses figure in aesthetic evaluations in all sorts of ways. The fact that an artwork produces a negative emotion like sadness doesn't make it a bad film. And similarly, an artwork can produce a positive emotion like laughter or happiness, without making it a good artwork. So why shouldn't moral reactions figure in aesthetic judgments in all sorts of ways as well? This point can be strengthened when we reflect on the nature of moral judgment. Moral judgments are fundamentally emotional. I'm pretty much an emotivist when it comes to morality. If you don't know what that means, see my series on meta-ethics. But even if you're a moral realist, even if you think there are moral facts, our moral judgments are clearly very strongly connected to our emotions. When we make moral judgments, they usually have emotional force for us. So I would put the point this way. We appreciate artworks that produce negative emotions, such as sadness and fear. Artworks that produce the most powerful negative emotions, the most powerful feelings of sadness and fear, will often be among our favourites. So why shouldn't we appreciate artworks that produce negative moral emotions? I mean, it's not like there's no response to this. I mean, there are some emotions that we don't want to feel towards an artwork, such as boredom. I'm never going to like an artwork that makes me feel bored. But that's pretty much the only example I can think of where we have a particular response and that makes it bad. So just prima facie, it seems to me we would expect moral reactions to kind of figure in aesthetic evaluation in all sorts of ways. A second prima facie point in favour of variabilism is that I think it captures the intuitions behind autonomism probably better than autonomist does. In particular, I have in mind the autonomist rejection of moralising. So really there are 2 points here. First, there's the concern with censorship. Once we allow a space for moral judgment about art, this will open the door for censorship of art. The second, we don't want artists to be moralisers. An artwork that's too moralistic will often be off-putting for that reason. We don't like it when an artwork hammers home its message, even when it's a good message. And conversely, we often enjoy artworks with bad messages. Now, those considerations are taken to support the idea that moral and aesthetic value are totally independent. But it seems to me that that the more obvious thing to say about that is just that moral and aesthetic value interact in different ways, depending on the artwork, depending on the circumstances. That's just a kind of prima facie point in favour of variabilism. So let's turn to some more sophisticated arguments. I'll go through a few arguments that I think don't work, and then at the end we'll examine one that I find persuasive. So, second, there's the argument from artistic practice. We've seen this before. We saw that the moralist tries to appeal to artistic practice, but actually I think this is more plausible as an argument for variabilism. The moralist says that if we look at the actual practice of artists throughout history, we find they've always been motivated by moral concerns. So to say that morality is autonomous from aesthetics just misses the point of what a lot of artists are trying to do. But it seems to me that it doesn't really support moralism, because although plenty of artists have been concerned about improving people's moral character, there have also been many artists who've tried to create morally bad or morally ambiguous artworks. There are artists who've intentionally flouted morality and tried to encourage others to flout it too. So the Marquis de Sade, on a plausible interpretation of his work, rejected morality. He wanted to create immoral works. It's important to be clear about this. Some people create morally bad artworks despite trying to be morally good. Triumph of the Will would be an example of this. Triumph of the Will was Nazi propaganda. I assume you all agree that that's morally repugnant. But the director, Leni Riefenstahl, certainly didn't feel this way about it, and neither did many people in her audience. She thought that Nazism was really great, and she was preaching to other people who thought it was really great. So Triumph of the Will wouldn't really be an example of someone trying to flout morality. There are also cases where artists might try to sort of get us to adopt a new moral perspective. Think of Ayn Rand. Rand knew that most people disagreed with her extremist capitalism, but she tried to persuade people to reform their views. Again, that's not really an example of an artist flouting morality. The Marquis de Sade was different. His books seem to look approvingly on torture and rape and sexual abuse. And on a plausible interpretation, he wasn't under the impression that, lots of people felt that these things were morally acceptable, and nor was he trying to get people to reform their morality. He wasn't saying that sexual abuse is good and we should all join him in feeling that sexual abuse is good. He simply didn't care whether it's good or bad. The attitude is, if it brings you pleasure to rape and torture, go and rape and torture. He simply didn't care about morality. He wanted to encourage us to reject morality, to behave immorally. If we find his works morally disturbing, he's achieved his end. Now, de Sade is an extreme case, but there are probably many artists who've tried to encourage us to tolerate lesser violations. So think of artworks that present criminal outlaws in positive ways. So, if you appeal to artistic practice, that would seem to support variabilism rather than moralism, it seems to me. I don't accept this argument. I already explained the problems with it in the last video, so I won't go over all of that again. My point is just, if you find it persuasive, then be a variabilist. Right, a third argument is based on the value of artistic experimentation. Art offers a unique opportunity to experiment with different perspectives. We can sort of try to adopt different ways of looking at the world in a safe environment, if you will. I mean, if you see a train crash in the real world, it's obviously inappropriate to laugh at it. But you can laugh at it if it happens in a comedy movie. Similarly, artworks offer a chance to explore different moral perspectives. This point has been developed by Matthew Kieran. Kieran argues that cognitive virtues can be aesthetic virtues. Something is cognitively good if it increases our knowledge and understanding. So to the extent that an artwork increases our knowledge, for this reason it can be aesthetically good. Next, he argues that artworks that have immoral perspectives can improve our knowledge, and in two ways. First of all, they challenge our current views. This is really just a point made well by John Stuart Mill in his defence of free speech. It's important to let everybody express their views, because when we come across views that seem outrageous to us, this forces us to re-examine our own views. I mean, I really like freedom. I have quite an extreme libertarian streak. But is it really best to organise society that way? Is it best to let people do whatever they want? Encountering views that are very different from my own, encountering sort of fascists, people with totally different moral perspectives, that kind of forces me to respond to challenges. It keeps my mind open to alternatives. So that's one respect in which, by being presented with an immoral perspective, you can improve your own views. Second, immoral artworks give us a first-hand experience of the morally bad perspective. If you read a novel that presents fascism in a positive light, that's not quite the same as listening to somebody give arguments in favour of fascism. Instead, you'll actually sort of see the world from their point of view. It puts you in the head of the fascist. It's a kind of first-hand experience of immorality. And according to Kieran, having this kind of first-hand experience gives us a richer understanding of morality, and that in itself allows us to understand moral goodness better. We understand the good in relation to the bad, so it's important to get a good understanding of moral evil. Perhaps another point we might make is that first-hand experience of an immoral perspective kind of allows us to see the fragility of goodness. We see how seductive things like fascism and racism and sexism can be, how easy it is to slip into those modes of thinking. But anyway, that's pretty much Kieran's argument. Artworks are aesthetically better for improving our knowledge, and immoral artworks improve our knowledge of immoral views. So immoral artworks can, for that reason, in virtue of their immorality, be morally good. I don't find this argument persuasive. First, I think the cognitive claim is wrong. Is improving our knowledge an aesthetic virtue? For me, I'd say it depends on the artwork in question. There are certainly some artworks that are designed to do this, such as documentaries. But for fictions, I think it's a mistake to be concerned about what they can teach you about the real world. A fiction, just by definition, is going to depart from the facts of the world. In fact, in a way, I'd say it's never really possible to learn anything from a fiction. A fiction might depict some event, say a battle taking place in the medieval era, and maybe this battle actually happened. But you couldn't really learn about it from the fiction, because the fiction is totally untrustworthy. I mean, maybe the fiction depicts the battle accurately, but maybe it doesn't. Because it's a fiction, you know that some things will be different. And you can't know exactly which things are different unless you learn about the battle from another, more reliable source. So essentially, you're going to have to suspend judgment about everything you encounter in that fictional artwork. So there's this, I think, a very deep conceptual problem with approaching fiction as something that can improve your knowledge. I don't see how it can do that. There's a second, bigger problem with Kieran's argument, which was pointed out by A.W. Eaton, which is that although this argument purports to be an argument for variabilism or immoralism, it collapses into moralism. For Kieran, what makes an immoral art aesthetically valuable is that it improves our moral knowledge. So what really makes immoral art aesthetically good isn't the immorality in itself, but rather the moral insights that it offers with this. But the moralist could agree with this. Nobody doubts that you can learn things by learning about immoral perspectives. The distinctive claim of variabilism is that a moral defect just in itself can be an aesthetic virtue. Kieran treats moral defects as means to an end, and in fact not just a means to any end, but means to a morally good end. The moral defect in the artwork improves our own morality. So it's kind of difficult to see how this is really an argument for variabilism. It sort of seems like he's just interpreting immoral art in a way that kind of makes it morally good. It just seems to take all of everything that's distinctive about variabilism out of it. Right. Next, this argument was originally given by Wayne Booth as an argument for moralism. I think it's more plausible as an argument for variabilism. Basically, Booth's argument has two steps. First, when we evaluate a work of art, he suggests that that's very much like choosing a friend. An artwork will have a certain character, have a certain attitude to things it depicts. So just as we befriend people based on their character and attitudes, we can draw an analogy to befriending artworks. I guess the pleasure we get from artworks, especially narrative artworks like TV series and books, they sort of are with you for a long time. I guess in some ways they're like the pleasure you get from friendship, so this has some plausibility as an analogy. But Booth pushes this analogy quite far. He says that narrative artworks have implied authors. The implied author is the perspective from which a story is being told. This need not be the actual author. For instance, I could, write a book that presents racism and slavery in a very positive light. I myself don't support racism and slavery, but the implied author of my book would do. Booth's idea is that when we say that an artwork has a particular character or particular attitude to the events it depicts, we're attributing this character and attitude to the artwork's implied author. And when we say that an artwork is morally bad, we're really saying that its implied author is morally bad. By appealing to the implied author, we can push the friendship analogy quite far. Booth says that part of what's involved in evaluating an artwork as aesthetically good is evaluating its implied author as a potential friend. If we think that the implied author of an artwork would be a good friend, this is an aesthetic virtue. If we think the implied author would be a bad friend, this is an aesthetic defect. The second part of Booth's argument is that we choose our friends based on their moral qualities. Part of what makes a person a good friend is that they're morally good. You wouldn't want to be friends with Hitler because his behaviour and attitudes are, really evil. So, from these 2 points, Booth concludes in favour of moralism. If the implied author of an artwork is morally defective, then the implied author would be a bad friend, and if we think that the implied author would be a bad friend, then this is an aesthetic defect in the artwork. But remember how we ended the last video? We discussed Susan Wolf's ideas about moral saints. We don't want ourselves or our friends to be moral saints. Moral sainthood is dull and boring. We admire moral defects. With this point in mind, Booth's argument becomes an argument for variabilism. If the implied author of a work is morally defective, these very moral defects can make him seem like he'd be a good friend. If he's morally perfect, we'd probably think he'd be a bad friend for that reason. So to lay out the argument more clearly, if the implied author of an artwork would be a good friend, this is an aesthetic virtue of the work. The moral defects of an implied author can be part of what would make him a good friend. So, moral defects can be aesthetic virtues. Put simply, we don't want artworks to be moral saints. I think this argument fails. For one thing, does aesthetic evaluation always involve making a judgment about the implied author? This might be true sometimes, in fact, probably most of the time, but I think in many cases we can engage with artworks in a much more detached kind of way. In fact, especially when there are a lot of artworks that sort of don't necessarily even have a perspective, abstract works and so on, but even films and books that we might say have a certain perspective on things, I think we can just sort of watch them in a detached kind of way. But even putting this point aside, the argument just draws far too strong a connection between friendship and artworks. Berescourt points out that we can often admire and in some ways like the implied author of an artwork without judging that this implied author would be a good friend. Gort gives the example of looking at Michelangelo's The Last Judgment. He says that when he looks at The Last Judgment, he feels a sense of awe and stunned admiration towards its creator, which is not something you'd associate with friendship. Friendship suggests that you're peers who are on the same level. Gort also says that the painting is in many ways quite dark and troubled, that it suggests that Michelangelo had a difficult, obsessional, troubled and despairing personality, which obviously would not be good in a friend. And we can think of examples of this outside of art. I mean, there are many people we might admire, but who we wouldn't want as friends. Think of like great scientists or great mathematicians who are brilliant at their work, but who are very obsessional. Maybe they're very short-tempered, tetchy kind of personalities. So even if we accept that judging artworks to be aesthetically good involves judging their implied authors positively, this doesn't necessarily involve judging that they be good friends. So I think that's quite a big problem with this argument. I think probably the most persuasive approach to variabilism that I've seen is given by A.W. Eaton. Now, Eaton begins by granting quite a lot to the moralist. Eaton agrees that that the moral flaws of an artwork can make it difficult for us to experience the emotions prescribed by an artwork. For instance, if an artwork tries to elicit admiration and pity for a Nazi. This is the familiar point we saw last time, made in the arguments by Noel Carroll and Berescourt. The response of pity and admiration for a Nazi would be morally unmerited. When we're confronted with somebody like a Nazi, somebody who's very morally repugnant, we experience what Eaton calls imaginative resistance towards having positive emotions towards them. In other words, if the artwork prescribes pity and admiration, we'll be reluctant to experience this. We feel a sort of moral revulsion at pitying a Nazi, and we feel moral revulsion towards artworks that try to get us to do this. So that should be the familiar kind of point we made last time. But Eaton argues that this actually is a source of significant aesthetic value. This kind of thing isn't necessarily a problem with an artwork. It can be a source of value. The artwork can be aesthetically valuable insofar as it generates but overcomes the audience's imaginative resistance. And there are 2 points that Eaton makes here. First of all, generating and overcoming imaginative resistance requires a great deal of artistic skill. First of all, the artist has to set up the imaginative resistance by presenting a morally repugnant character in a positive light. She takes a character who's a Nazi, gives him traits that make him sympathetic or admirable. The audience is going to resist this. You don't want to feel sympathy or admiration for a Nazi. So what the artist needs to do is develop the artwork in such a way, develop the character in such a way, that you feel those positive emotions despite your better judgment. And as Eaton points out, there's this kind of intriguing balancing act going on here. Here's what he says about the novel Lolita, which I've never read. But as I understand it, the main character, Humbert, is a paedophile who's presented in a sympathetic way. Eaton says, foregrounding Humbert's perversion and brutality too much, perhaps by including graphic sex scenes, would sabotage his charm, likability and sympathetic nature. However, minimising Humbert's flaws too much would render him benign. So, we admire this significant artistic skill that's required to make us sympathetic to evil characters. Eaton conceives of this in terms of problem solving. The artist sets a problem for herself. How do I get the audience to feel things they don't want to feel? It takes a lot of skill to do this properly. Second, and I think more importantly, the state of conflict created by such artworks is highly valuable simply for its own sake. When we admire repugnant characters, we have contradictory attitudes. Our moral attitudes pulling us one way. They're telling us to reject this horrible character and reject the artwork that looks positively on them. But we can't turn away, we can't help ourselves, we find ourselves seduced into liking them. Eaton puts it very nicely. He says that we are left to linger in a delicious state of irresolvable conflict with ourselves. He calls it an indefinitely protracted state of ambivalence. This is an unusual and peculiar feeling. It's compelling, it's memorable. In other words, it's a significant aesthetic achievement. I find this point in particular very intriguing. Unfortunately, Eaton doesn't really develop it in much detail, so that's what I'm going to try to do now. My suggestion is that moral properties count as aesthetic virtues when they figure as part of rich experiences. The concept of rich experience was developed by Aaron Smuts in the context of the paradox of tragedy. I have a video about that, so you can go and watch that if you want to know more. Basically, what is a rich experience? Well, consider your everyday experiences. Right now, you're at home, I assume, looking at a computer screen, sitting in a reasonably comfortable chair, wearing standard familiar clothes, and so on. You're having an everyday experience. A rich experience is one that involves novel and unfamiliar things, or it has some deep meaning and significance to your life, or it involves engaging your capacities of empathy and imagination, or it produces states of heightened emotion. To put it in the colloquial terms, a rich experience is one that makes you feel alive. It's one where you get the most out of the moment. And it need not be like one thing. A rich experience can unfold over a long period of time, so that individual experiences, moods and emotions can all form part of the larger rich experience. Obviously, this definition is vague, but that's really a feature, not a bug. This notion of rich experience is supposed to be a very broad category. It can apply to all sorts of things. So, mountain climbing, visiting the zoo, whitewater rafting, watching one of your favourite films, going to a music concert, visiting an S&M dungeon, going for a walk in the woods, taking 200 micrograms of LSD. All of these things will produce rich experiences. And there are 2 points that are important to note. First of all, rich experiences can be produced relatively easily. In particular, artworks are a very good source of rich experiences. A great book will provide novel and unfamiliar things. It will have some important meaning to you. It will engage your empathy. It will produce heightened emotions. We look for artworks that provide us with rich experiences. This is one of the main functions of art. An artwork is at its best when it does this well. The second point is that rich experiences don't have to be pleasant to be fulfilling. We enjoy the disturbing, the sad, the scary, the confusing. We enjoy unpleasant, rich experiences. And this is especially obvious with artworks. Many of our favourite artworks are ones that produce the most powerful unpleasant experiences. Again, see my videos on the paradox of tragedy for more detail about this. So, with that sort of framework in mind, the final point is simply that moral properties can be part of rich experiences. In particular, a moral defect can figure as part of a rich experience. And this is just the point that Eaton raised, that morally defective artworks can produce this state of conflict, this state of ambivalence. That's a classic, a perfect paradigm example of a rich experience. So let's consider some examples to flesh this out a bit. Well, as you've probably noticed in this series, I enjoy Game of Thrones. It's a fantastic show. It seems to me that Game of Thrones is morally defective. I mean, on the one hand, you're not supposed to side with the really evil people, like Joffrey or Ramsay or Peter Baelish. You don't go with them. But its moral attitude isn't exactly good. I mean, consider one of the very first events in the show, where Ned Stark beheads a teenager, for something that by our standards would barely merit a slap on the wrist. The teenager doesn't even get like a proper trial or anything like that. He just kind of gets caught and then his head gets cut off. The show doesn't condemn this. In fact, the beheading is presented perfectly straightforwardly. If anything, it's used to show what an honourable character Ned Stark is, because there's all that stuff that he says to his kid about, the man who passes the sentence must swing the sword. It makes him look like a really good guy. So Game of Thrones presents as admirable people and actions that we would usually condemn very seriously. I mean, he beheaded some teenager. That's awful. Another example would be Kurosawa's film Ran, which was based on King Lear. Ran doesn't prescribe positive responses to repugnant characters, but the general attitude of the film is extremely dark and nihilistic and cynical. It has a very unpleasant attitude towards human nature. Straw Dogs. The general message of the film seemed to involve a kind of celebration of macho violence. This guy starts out as a very timid, weak professor, but he learns how to be a man, how to be violent. And furthermore, it's pretty much like a sort of rape revenge film where this guy's wife gets raped, but he's the one who has the revenge. It's as though everything in the film is for his benefit. It's all about turning him into a man who can fight. She's just there to get raped and otherwise look pretty. A Clockwork Orange seems to celebrate its protagonist, etc. I mean, you can fill out your own examples of this. All of these films will leave you feeling kind of morally depressed or confused or repulsed. And that's precisely what makes them so special. We place great value on these sorts of feelings because they're not the sorts of things that you feel in everyday life. It's this internal conflict. It's unusual. It's a rich experience. One clarification here is, well, recall we're arguing for variabilism, for the claim that a moral defect is sometimes an aesthetic virtue and sometimes an aesthetic defect. Eaton's argument plus the appeal to rich experiences explains how a moral defect can be an aesthetic virtue. But does it explain how a moral defect can be an aesthetic defect? Yes, I think it does. This will occur if the artwork generates imaginative resistance but fails to overcome it. In this case, our moral objections to the artwork will simply block the responses that the artwork prescribes. We won't feel admiration for the repugnant protagonist. And worse, we won't feel the delicious conflict that happens when the artwork succeeds in overcoming our moral resistance. So if A Clockwork Orange had sort of failed to imbue the main character with enough kind of admirable traits, then we just sort of wouldn't go along with the way that the film seemed to admire him. So we don't have to say that every moral flaw will be an aesthetic virtue. Furthermore, many moral virtues will be aesthetic virtues. When an artwork adopts a perspective that we find morally good, that can also figure as part of a rich experience, although in a very different way, obviously. Now, one obvious response to this is simply to note that many seemingly immoral works aren't really immoral. Many works that seem to commend an immoral perspective actually don't commend it. The main way this comes about is due to artists using what Berescourt calls the seduction strategy. The artist presents an immoral perspective in a positive light in order to seduce us into accepting it, but where the ultimate point is to lead us to moral reflection, to lead us to see the flaws of the immoral perspective. So the real perspective of the artwork is perfectly moral. A Clockwork Orange, for instance, is not really endorsing rape. It doesn't really want us to admire Alex. It tries to get us to admire Alex in order to prompt moral reflection. I think this point is perfectly true, but it's not strong enough to defeat variabilism. There are three big problems. First, the same could be said for many seemingly moral artworks. It's a point that cuts both ways. An artwork could present a seemingly moral perspective, but where its real perspective is actually immoral. Second, and maybe relatedly, artworks always admit of different interpretations. We can say that an artwork has whatever moral perspective we like. We can force it into whatever box we want, because artworks are always open to interpretation. So this ends up making moralism unfalsifiable in a sense, because any time we find an artwork which seems morally bad, and where the moral badness seems to be an aesthetic virtue, we can reinterpret it and say, well, actually it's morally good. And I wouldn't say that this is incorrect. I don't think that any interpretation of an artwork is incorrect, no matter how outlandish it is. But it does, of course, come across as fairly ad hoc and disingenuous. So for the moralist's response to work, he has to kind of reinterpret every single artwork that sort of seems morally bad and that is, seemingly aesthetically good. And, that just seems, as I say, it just seems ad hoc. It doesn't really seem like a very appealing strategy. But finally, putting aside these points, the biggest problem is that this sort of response is just beside the point. Let's grant, for the sake of argument, that A Clockwork Orange is actually morally good. The suggestion is that A Clockwork Orange presents an immoral perspective, but only to prompt moral reflection. It displays but doesn't endorse the immoral perspective. Okay, fine. In fact, from what I've read about A Clockwork Orange, that's actually a very plausible way of looking at it. But notice how Eaton's argument worked. The point is that when we watch something like A Clockwork Orange, this generates conflict in us. And this feeling is part of what makes the film so aesthetically good. But what generates this conflict is the immoral perspective. When we watch the film, it seems to be presenting Alex in a positive light, and this creates an internal conflict that we value. Now, maybe when we get to the end of the film, we realise, well, actually it isn't really endorsing Alex, it just seemed to be. Well, so what? How does that change anything? In other words, we find its immorality aesthetically valuable while we think that it is genuinely immoral. And that's enough to establish the variabilist conclusion. It simply makes no difference if, later on, we realise that actually it wasn't genuinely immoral. We could also question the very concept of rich experiences. That would be another way to attack the argument presented here. And there are problems with that concept, but I discuss it and defend it in the Paradox of Tragedy video. So I think that's pretty much it for now. That's the end of this series. I think those are the main sort of views: autonomism, moralism, and variabilism. So I hope that was helpful. Goodbye.